We had just finished setting up our two Spandaus when the noise of tanks rolling over the brush behind us made us shudder. On that magnificent summer afternoon, German tanks were once again leaving the shade and driving toward the east. From behind them, entire regiments, bent double, passed us and vanished into a wall of dust, which hid them from view. About 5 minutes later, the Russians began a bombardment of unprecedented ferocity. Everything became opaque, and the sun vanished from our eyes, which had become enormous with fright. The storm cloud of dust was relieved only by continuous red flashes shooting up against the darker masses of trees 80 or 100 yards away. The earth shook harder than I had felt it do, and the brush behind us burst into flame. Screams of fear froze in our constricted throats. Everything seemed displaced. The air all around us was filled with flying clods, mixed with fragments of metal and fire. Krauss and one of the newcomers were buried in a landslide before they even knew what had happened to them. I threw myself into the deepest corner of our hole and stared uncomprehendingly at the stream of earth flooding towards our shelter. I began to howl like a madman. Hals pressed his filthy head against mine, and our helmets clattered together like two mess tins. Halsey's face was transfigured by terror. "It's the end," he gasped, his words broken up by the explosions, which took away our breath. Overwhelmed by horror, I could only agree. Suddenly, a human figure crashed into the hole. We both trembled with desperation and fright. Then a second human shape joined the first in a great leap. This time our huge eyes took in that these two were of our own men. One of the newcomers shouted to us through his frantic gasp for breath, "My whole company was wiped out. It's terrible." He carefully lifted his head just over the edge of the embankment as a series of explosions began to rip through the air beside us. His helmet and a piece of his head were sent flying, and he fell backward with a horrifying cry. His shattered skull crashed into Halsey's hands, and we were splattered with blood and fragments of flesh. Hals threw the revolting cadaver as far as he could and buried his face in the dirt. The explosions had become so violent that we felt the ground all around us must be shifting. Outside our hole, on the torn and ravaged plain, we could hear an engine roaring out of control. Then there was another explosion more violent than all the others, and an enormous flash of light swept the edge of our trench. Our two Spandaus fell back on top of us in a wave of loose earth. Those who weren't struck down with fright howled like madmen. About 30 soldiers on the run plunged in with us. We were kicked and shoved without mercy, as everyone tried to burrow down as deeply as possible. Whoever was left on top was finished. The earth all around us was pocked with thousands of shell holes, and from each of these we could hear the sounds of fleeing soldiers looking for refuge. But the cruel Russian soil was torn by fresh salvos, and those who thought they had been saved continued to die. We heard the roar of airplane engines, and cheers for the Luftwaffe rose from thousands of desperate men. The bombardment continued for a few more seconds, and then decreased dramatically. The officers who were still alive blew their whistles for retreat, and the men packed into our hole poured out like rabbits chased by a ferret. We were about to follow when our Stabfeldwebel, who hadn't yet been killed, shouted loudly after us, "Not you. We're here to stop a Russian counteroffensive. Get your guns ready to fire." 6 Hitler Youth cadavers were lying on the bottom of the trench, which had completely changed shape. To the left, one end was caved in, and Krauss's boots were sticking out 2 cubic yards of gray dirt. The other grenadier had been completely buried. With the help of the veteran, whose face was streaming with blood, we were able to get the FM back into place. The plane, which had been altered beyond recognition, was scarred with holes and lumps, as if giant moles had been at work. Wherever one looked, there were smoke and flame, and a scattering of motionless bodies. In the distance, through spirals of dust and smoke, We could see geysers of fire from the bombs which our NE-110s were dropping on the Russian artillery. It looked as though we had hit a couple of their ammunition dumps. The shock waves from those explosions engulfed the earth and sky in an extraordinary intensity of light and displacement of air. Our ME-110s turned back to the west, and the Russian artillery opened up again. They were concentrating especially on the panzers, which were retreating in disorder, with at least half their number destroyed. Although my left arm had almost been broken when a gang of panic-stricken soldiers jumped into the trench on top of us, I had felt nothing at the time. Now it was beginning to cause me violent pain, which hovered beside me like a supplementary presence. But I was too busy to pay much attention to it. The bombardment was continuing to the north and to the south. It then passed over us once again, intensifying and spreading its complement of pain and terror. Our group of stupefied men could breathe only with difficulty. We were madmen, gesturing and moving without thought or hope. Our legs and arms were numbed by hours of crowding and shoving against neighbors, living or dead, who were taking up too much room. The Stabsfeldwebel repeated mechanically that we must maintain our position, but each new series of explosions sent us plunging to the bottom of our hole. Night fell before we realized day had ended, and with darkness our terror returned. Limberg, whose nervous condition was alarming, had collapsed into a kind of stupor which, for the moment, made him oblivious of hell. The Sudeten was almost as badly affected. He had begun to tremble like someone in a fit, and to vomit uncontrollably. Madness had invaded our group and was gaining ground rapidly. In a state of semi-delirium, I saw a giant, whom I had known in another time as Hals, leap to his machine gun and fire at the sky, which continued to pour down its rain of flame and metal. I also saw the Stabs, seized by a kind of dementia, beat the ground with his clenched fist, and then deliberately turn on the surviving grenadier and pound him. The grenadier, who seemed to be functioning normally until that moment, simply stared at the Stabs like someone in a trance and then burst into tears. I could hear the millions of echoes ringing through the ground with an almost infernal precision, and I felt that I was going to faint. I stood up totally unaware of what I was doing, shouting curses and obscenities at the sky. I had reached the edge of the abyss, like all my companions, and like them, I was nearly finished. My rage burned like a straw fire, consuming my last reserves of strength. My head began to swim, and I fell forward against the edge of the trench. My mouth, which was wide open, filled with dirt. I began to vomit, and I knew I wouldn't be able to stop until I had emptied myself completely. I waded through my vomit with my trembling hands stretched out in front of me, reaching for the support of the crumbling parapet. A white flash, like an element of a nightmare, lit the darkness which had enveloped us and kept me from losing consciousness. I slowly raised my eyes above the level of the trench wall to follow the Russian flare as it fell to the ground. During those moments, I felt strangely certain that I was at home, that none of my surroundings existed, and that the descending flare was really a falling star. I remained in my stupor for a long time, while the explosions continued to compress my lungs. Some men stood in one position for hours, asleep on their feet with their eyes wide open. Finally, toward midnight, everything fell silent. However, no one moved. We all felt so weakened that movement was beyond the limit of possibility. Finally, the veteran was able to make us pay attention. "Don't go to sleep, boys. This is when Ivan will attack." The Stabs stared at him with troubled eyes. He stood up and leaned against the trench wall. A few minutes later, his head fell forward, and he was lost in paralytic sleep. The veteran continued to exhort us, but the 6 of us who were left received his pleas with a silence as absolute as the silence of our 8 corpses. Sleep was crushing us, as the gallants had not quite managed to do. If the Russians had chosen that moment to attack, they would have undoubtedly saved a great many lives on their side. Our advance interception positions were manned only by sleepers and dead men. Although there must have been more noise from the big guns and more flares, our ears picked up nothing for the next 4 hours. We eventually began to wake up, although we remained exhausted. The sky once again was turning pink, and we could already see the chaos scattered across the plain. Everything was calm, and we couldn't hear a sound. We stared out at the enormous space surrounding us. We got out some tins of food and tried to eat and talk a little. "That's right, you should build up your strength," joked the Stobs, who was living through his last moments. "I'd be surprised if this quiet lasted." "Maybe it will, though," someone else said. "That show yesterday must have done in quite a few fellows. We might even get 2 or 3 days like this." "I doubt it," said the Stobs. "The Fuhrer has given the order to march east, and nothing can stop our troops now. The offensive will begin as soon as the sun is up." "Do you really think so?" asked Lindbergh, excited as usual when something seemed to be going our way. "Will our troops be able to knock out those Russian guns?" "If it starts up again," Hals muttered to me, "I'll go right off my rocker." "Or be killed," I answered. "We can't expect the same luck we had yesterday." "You too," said the Stobs, pointing to Hals and me. "You keep your eyes open for another couple of hours while the rest of us try to get some sleep. But first we have to get rid of these stiffs." He waved at the 8 mutilated corpses, which were already beginning to swarm with big blue flies. I was just about to examine my bruised shoulder when a roll of thunder shook the pure morning air. A second later, a hail of rushing shells fell all around us, and once again we collapsed in terror at the bottom of our hole. "It's starting again," someone shouted. Hals was moving closer to me. Through a shower of flying clods, he had just opened his mouth to say something when a violent explosion very near us drowned the sound of his voice. "We'll never be able to hold on," he said. "We'd better get out." Lindbergh had begun to tremble again. Then the Russian fire stopped. The veteran peered carefully out, and after him our 7 heads rose above the rampart. We stared at the plain, which was still scattered with trailing clouds of dust. In the distance, besides the wood, someone was howling. "They must be running short of shells," said the Stobs, grinning. "Otherwise, they wouldn't have stopped so quickly." The veteran looked at him with his habitual resigned expression. "I was just thinking the same thing about our artillery, Stabsfeldwebel. I was wondering why they weren't firing. We're preparing for an offensive. That's why our side is quiet. Soon we'll see our tanks." The veteran stared at the horizon. "I'm sure," the Stobs went on, "that our offensive will begin again any time now." But we were watching the veteran. His eyes were growing wider and wider, and so was his mouth, which seemed ready to howl. The Stobs had shut up too, and we all followed the direction of our gunners' eyes. In the remote distance, a thin black line stretched from one end of the horizon to the other, and was moving toward us like a wave rolling toward the shore. We stood watching for a moment. The line was dense and somehow unreal. Then the veteran shouted in a voice which paralyzed us with fear, "It's the Siberians, they're here. There must be at least 1 million of them." "Every man to his post," shouted the Stobs, whose eyes remained fixed as if hypnotized on the irresistible Soviet tide. Lindbergh's face was quivering as if he were about to burst into tears. The veteran wasn't shouting anymore. His gun was on the crook of his shoulder. His finger was on the trigger, and his teeth were clenched tightly enough to break. The Soviet war cry was growing continuously louder and more distinct. It was like a long shout, muffled with its great volume. We remained frozen by the danger, unable to judge its magnitude. Our stupor was too great. We were like paralyzed mice facing a snake. Then Lindbergh broke down. He began to cry and shout, and left his post, throwing himself down on the trench floor. "They'll kill us, they'll kill us, we'll all be killed." But now we could hear the Russian cries more distinctly, a huge, continuous hurrah. The human way was now about 400 yards from us. We could also hear the throb of engines and see 3 planes high in the brightened sky. "Planes," said the Sudeten, but we had all noticed them already. Our anxious eyes left the Russian horde for a moment. The airplane engines were screaming as the planes died down at top speed. Messerschmitt shouted the Stabs, "What guts!" "Hurrah!" we all shouted, "Hurrah for the Luftwaffe!" The three planes were strung out over the huge Russian thrust, spraying it with death. This seemed to be a signal for our mortars to open fire. They were hidden in the brush and had lengthened their range. The Spandaus, which had survived the bombardment, began to fire too, while the planes died down, stimulating our troops to a feverish pitch of courage. I could feel the FM cartridges running through my hand at a dizzying speed. One clip was emptied, and we started another. Some of the big Wehrmacht guns had also opened fire, which must have had a lethal effect on the ranks of Bolsheviks, who were charging as in the days of Napoleon. However, the human tide continued to roll toward us, making our scalps crawl. Only the weight of our helmets kept our filthy hair from standing straight up on our heads. Although the idea of death itself no longer terrified us, my eyes remained fixed on the smoky metal of the FM and the steady hands of the veteran. The trembling belt of cartridges moved forward into the machine, shaken as if by a titanic frenzy. "Prepare the grenade," shouted the Stabs, who was firing with his Luger braced on his left arm. "It's useless," shouted the veteran even louder. "We haven't got enough ammunition. We can't stop them. Order the retreat, Stabsfeldwebel, while there's still time." Our frantic eyes moved from the lips of one man to the other. The Russian war cry, "Hurrah, Pobeda," roared closer and closer. The men were firing from their hips as they ran, and the air shook with the rushing flight of their bullets. "You're crazy," answered the Stabs. "No one can get away from here, and our boys should be coming any minute now, so keep firing." But the veteran had already loaded his FM and picked up his last magazine. "You're the one who's crazy. Any minute now is too late. But you go ahead and die right here if that's what you want." "No," shouted the Stabs. The veteran had just jumped up from the trench and was galloping towards the woods, bent over as far as he could and calling to us as he ran. We grabbed our guns in frantic haste. "Run!" shouted the Sudeten. We all followed him. For a moment we were almost mad with terror, racing toward the shattered trees with our lungs on fire, while Russian bullets whistled through the air all around us. There were still 7 of us, which seemed astonishing. The Stabs had finally followed everyone else, but were still protesting and shouting, "Cowards, shoot back. You'll all be killed. Put up a fight." "I'll report you for this," the Stabs yelled. "I know," the veteran said, gasping, almost laughing, "but I'd take one of our firing squads over Ivan's bayonet any day." The veteran had barely finished speaking when our non-com suddenly cried out and stood up, flapping his arms in an almost comical way. Then he ran back down the little hill and collapsed, with his face pressed into the ground.